Will AI wipe out translations? Some people claim that it will wipe it out entirely and are quitting their jobs as translators or being fired or not getting any more work. Other people say it won't change it at all and things are going to continue just as they were, right? This is just another iteration of machine translation, which basically changed the industry a little bit, but left it for the most part unaltered. My position is neither. It's neither that it's going to leave things unaltered like machine translation did, and it's also not going to be the end of everything. But my position is that it will change fundamentally the way people approach translations. And the way it will change is very contextual in the sense that it's going to be different in every single circumstance. So let's say, for instance, here, today I was in Slack and Slack has added translation as a feature. So that if I get in a message from a coworker, I can hit the translate now button using AI, and I'm going to be able to pretty much understand, in most cases, the message that I got from my coworker, and that's good enough, right? So that translation as a feature situation will, let's say, annihilate the need for having a translator translating that message, right? The first question that I have is, would that message ever be translated before anyway, right? Probably not. What probably would happen is that either I would communicate in my broken English or someone would communicate in their broken English and we would figure out some way to get the message across, or we wouldn't be able to work together at all. But that's, in my opinion, that's the kind of situation that I would label as a greenfield situation, where something that wasn't previously translated now is getting translated by AI. So let's call that the greenfield situation. And that's happening in all kinds of translation as a feature situations, right? Maybe it's a Google Doc, maybe it's Canva. But what I would say is that even in this greenfield situation, the more complex that document become, right? So let's say at first we're talking about a message on Slack. If I'm talking about a contract on Google Docs, or if we're talking about a presentation on Canva, then I think we are indeed talking about something that not that green, because it's probably in many cases preying on what previously would have been sent over for a human to translate or someone to look at the layout, etc. Right? So there we're starting to move down the spectrum. As content complexity evolves, we begin to prey on the work that was previously done by human translators. But that's not entirely the case, right? There are many people who were maybe working with Canva and they just were operating in one language. And because Canva now allows people to use this translation as a feature situation, maybe they're now sending out their presentations in 2 languages or 3 languages, right? Maybe they're still having someone check that over. But basically, you start seeing that as content gets more complex, then you begin to prey a little bit on, or prey significantly on, work that was previously being sent to humans. And that is a common denominator of this conversation, right? As content becomes more complex, either because of regulatory issues. So let's say, for instance, you are a pharmaceutical company and you need to file something with the FDA or something like that. You're probably not going to just have AI translate that for you for liability reasons, for other implications. And because of that, it's work that's probably not going to change very significantly. Like maybe the humans that were involved in that work were already using machine translation. AI and machine translation are, you could argue that AI is a little bit better. It's not an entirely world better compared to neural machine translation. So you're not fundamentally shifting something. You're just changing things around if you're talking about that kind of work. Marketing translation, same kind of deal, right? Just like in copywriting, you're not going to fundamentally stop copywriting just because GPT or Claude can write pretty good copy in English. You're probably going to still want people overseeing that copywriting process, making sure that they're happy with the outcomes. Same thing with marketing translations. You're probably going to want people who are going to be owning those outcomes in different languages. After all, when you're translating, let's say, from English into Korean and Brazilian Portuguese and Spanish, you're not just relaying information accurately, you're actually adapting, you're actually looking at brand values, you're looking at the audience. There are a ton of little decisions that need to be made, right? So that kind of content, in my opinion, also remains, for the most part, untouched. Like I said, maybe the process will change a little bit. Maybe it's going to become more of a post-editing situation and less of a translating from scratch. But that's already happening with copywriting in English anyway, right? Who sits to write copy in English from scratch these days? Right? Maybe some people, a lot of people are working with these models to expedite their process as long as they can, and as long as they can own the outcome, and as long as they can stand by the deliverables that they're producing for their clients. For most people, that's okay. So you have all this spectrum, right? You have, if you're working in a more commoditized way, the odds that your work will become of very little value or be replaced by a large language model is very high. And that's not only in translations, that's for any kind of situation. And that's one of the reasons why that study that Microsoft published a few weeks ago is so distorted, right? Because they're already filtering for content that people found compatible with sending through a large language model, right? And maybe that was, like I said, a small little paragraph here and there. Maybe it was a small little contract that they would send over to another lawyer attorney who could speak that language to look over. But basically, you're restricting the use case. It's not like people were translating entire websites on Copilot. It's not like people were translating entire marketing campaigns or legal patents, things like that, right? They were translating content that was already filtered by people who deemed that content to be model worthy, right? So there's a very big difference between content that's already deemed by someone as model worthy and things that actually are mission critical and are required for the company to produce, to exist, to sell, right? So when we look at the spectrum, it's pretty easy to separate that. You have, on one end, if the work is highly commoditized, if it's highly repeatable, if it doesn't add a ton of value, either for creative reasons or for legal reasons, it's likely to be replaced by a large language model of some kind, and if not now, in the future. The interesting things happen is when the use case is small, right? So you have, like I said, the smallest bit, like a Slack message or and of little consequence, right? So it's like you can think about a quadrant, right? You have on one end of the quadrant little content with little consequence. That content is very, very a very high candidate of becoming entirely replaced by AI. As you move down this quadrant or across this quadrant and you go into content that has high content, a lot of content, but low impact, then that content is less likely to be simply processed by a model, because even though it has low impact, it's still important content. Maybe it could be like a whole knowledge base, right? Most companies that invest money in producing a product and creating a knowledge base, they want to have some kind of ownership over what's going on, and more than ownership, accountability, governance, right? Everything may be fine and dandy, but what if they have to change a term? What if the language is not inclusive enough? What if the language is too aggressive in a given culture, right? So they need systems, they need processes, they need people to manage this. Now, maybe they're not going to be translating word for word, but they're going to require people to manage this overall process. And those people will be translators, because they need people who speak the different languages to be able to make these judgment calls, these arbitrations, right? So just from going from low content, low exposure to big content, low exposure, you already see a shift. Now, if we think about low content, high exposure, that's definitely a case where you want someone looking at that, right? Maybe it's a tweet, but you have 200,000 followers. It's not going to be interesting to publish that tweet in a different language and completely lose the meaning, particularly because tweets, for instance, are very self-contained, self-encapsulated, have a lot of cultural references, and it's really easy to completely lose the intended meaning, right? So that's also something really important. And then you have the content that is, let's say, the content that's less likely to be touched at all by AI, or be not touched, but erased by AI, which is the content in the quadrant that is high volume content and high visibility content or high exposure content, like a legal patent or like a marketing campaign, a website, a consumer-facing app, right? That's content that people want to have ownership over. And that's the key word, right? So if you're working with content that was, things maybe, let's say a lot of your work was just day-to-day memos, things that people needed to understand to make a company operate, that kind of work is very susceptible to being completely replaced by AI. But if you were working on content that was consumer-facing, marketing-oriented, or legal, things like that, chances are that your work is likely, at least for now, very well protected against all of these advances from AI. So the point of my video today is just really to illustrate that not all content is created equally, right? You have very different kinds of content with very different kinds of treatment in its original language, and consequently very kind of different treatment as well during the translation process. And what does this say for translators, right? For translators, for me, the most important message is it's not necessarily, maybe you do experience a huge decrease in income or a huge decrease in demand. That's possible. But that decrease in demand isn't necessarily indicative that the entire industry is in decline. It may be only indicative that the kinds of clients and the kinds of content that were previously routed over to you are no longer being routed through a human. And I think what's important about that message is that there is room to adapt, there's room to change, there's room to evolve. It's not necessarily that the whole industry is in decline. It is, in my opinion, the idea that a lot of content that wasn't previously translated now is getting translated. A lot of content that was previously translated by humans is no longer being translated by humans. And a lot of content that was previously translated by humans is now leveraging some form of AI, whether through machine translation or artificial intelligence, right? And I think underlying all of this is the idea that people need a way to create governance around all of this. Because if you're a large company, for instance, and you're using translation as a feature in Slack, and you're also using translation as a feature in Canva, for instance, you're probably interested in being able to retain some kind of knowledge over these different interactions. You're probably interested in retaining some kind of terminology consistency. Let's say you're translating a course in Articulate, and you're also translating your product. It would be very interesting if your Articulate course would reference your product. And that's maybe the biggest danger of these translation as a feature projects, is that they're treating translations all as little one-offs, right? So it's like this one-off in Canva, this one-off in Articulate. And translations are rarely one-offs, quite the opposite, right? Translations are part of a bigger program that is managing the entire way a brand expresses itself, the entire way a brand communicates with its buyers, its employees, its audiences, whatever they may be. Thanks so much for watching. Leave your comments below. Would really love to know what you think about all of this. Till next time.